This is a dual story, and a reminder not to let old tech become e-waste. I've acquired two old laptops, both from the same person. They're similar tiers of laptop, but they're 6 years apart. From 2004, I have an HP Pavilion, and 2010, a Sony VAIO. Laptops don't have many ways to upgrade them, and these days even fewer, potentially RAM and storage. Components like RAM and CPU are often soldered to the motherboard to minimize thickness, but also the RAM being soldered closer to the processor allows it to be a little faster. But back in the day, you could even upgrade the processors on laptops. Finding these components can be really cheap on places like eBay because people don't really have use for stuff this old, but maybe you could. While we can't necessarily upgrade the graphics of these old laptops, mostly because they're icky Intel integrated graphics, some games can run, especially if you keep expectations in check. Our older HP is actually better of the two in terms of features for their time. On the front of the device, there are stereo speakers, indicator lights, and a physical latch to open the computer. A microphone port and dual headphone ports. You don't see that every day. On the right side of the device, there's two USB 2 ports, a 1394A port, a 6-in-1 card reader, a rewritable optical drive, and an S-video out. On the left side of the HP, we find a VGA port, an expansion port 2, RJ45 for networking, and an RJ11 for modem, a third USB 2 port, a PC card slot, and a Kensington lock. On the back of the device, we have exhaust vents and a port for the power connector, which is rated for 65 watts. Unfortunately, most of these ports don't have uses anymore, other than USB and the odd CD. Opening the lid, we have a great selection of multimedia keys above the keyboard, and below we have an itty-bitty trackpad. How was this ever acceptable? But my favorite feature of this laptop might very well be its display. A 14-inch 16x10 WXGA 1280 by 768 FTF display. It's not a lot by any means these days, but it's actually really good for the early 2000s, and even embarrasses laptop displays much newer than this. This was meant to be a thin light, and maybe in the early 2000s it was, but this bitch is an inch thick and weighs over 5 pounds. By default, this laptop had an Intel Celeron M330, 1.4 GHz single core with 512 kilobytes of L2 cache with a 24.5 watt TDP, launched in April 2004. Two 256 megabyte 333 MHz SODIMM DDR, and a 60 gig Fujitsu IDE hard drive. And that's all good enough for the Windows XP Home Edition that this laptop came with, at least for basic tasks, but I wanted to max this little guy out. But before we do that, let's check out our other contender. The Sony VAIO is a larger and mildly thinner laptop. It's slightly more modern in terms of features or aesthetics, but this looks very much like a laptop from 2010. Don't think about it too much, but that was almost 15 years ago. I did it. I thought about it. Oopsie. On the front of this device is a microphone port and a headphone port, a memory stick duo slot, as well as an SD card slot. There's a little switch to enable wireless connectivity, but spoilers, we won't be connecting to the internet on these old devices anymore. The right side of this device has 3 USB 2 ports, a Blu-ray player and a Kensington lock, and on the left side an Express Card 34 slot for expansion, as well as eSATA, HDMI, VGA, some vintage, an Ethernet port, and a barrel jack for power. Opening her up, we see a slightly larger trackpad than in the much older HP, and a full-size keyboard to fit the length of the much larger 15.5-inch 1366 by 768 LCD display. Above said display is a Motion Eye camera, which is a neat addition, but it will never be used again. By default, this had an i3 330M, 2.13 GHz, 4 GB of 1066 MHz SODIMM DDR3, a 500 gig 5400 RPM hard drive, and ran Windows 7 Home Premium. You may notice the lack of battery, and that's because batteries degrade over time. This one unfortunately no longer holds a charge at all. However, the HP battery, while very much degraded, at least can be unplugged for a few minutes to be moved from the charger. This laptop, however, needs to be plugged in at all times to receive power. Back to the HP, we're going to be using Windows XP Service Pack 3, but that means we'll never connect this device to the internet. That would be irresponsible. That goes for both of these laptops, but you could put Linux on them, but that's not what I'm doing here. I want DirectX and old Windows software and games. The Sony is going to be running Windows 7 Home Premium because that's the OS this device came with. I could have done Windows 7 Ultimate, but it uses slightly more disk space, and I don't need any of the extra minute features that Windows 7 Ultimate has over Home Premium. To upgrade these PCs, I turned to eBay to find the best value processor, as well as to max out the RAM, and finally, storage. For the HP, I found a single-core Pentium M at 1.6 GHz, twice the L2 cache at 1 MB, otherwise still 130 nanometer Banias chip, or is it Banias? And I found this on eBay for $10.14. Upgrading the 512 megabytes of memory, I found two 1 gig sticks of the same speed, 333 MHz for $10.89. Finally, to replace the 60 gig IDE hard drive, I had to find an IDE adapter, and due to the space constraints, I got an IDE to SD card adapter, and I'm using a 64 gig SanDisk ImageMate. It's possible I could get slightly better performance out of a better SD card, but this is probably plenty fine for running Windows XP in my games. This adapter was $12.81 and I already had the SD card. For the Sony, I upgraded the 32nm Arendelle i3-350M, which was a dual core with hyperthreading, 2.26 GHz with 3 MB of L3 cache, whose built-on Intel HD graphics had a turbo of 667 MHz. I had found an i5-560M, also a 2-core 4-thread chip, but at 2.66 GHz with a boost of 3.2, still 3 MB of cache, but with a graphics turbo of 766 MHz, all for $13.47. I got a second 4GB stick of 1066 MHz SODIMM DDR3 memory from ATEC for $10.69, and lastly for the SSD, I had a Samsung 850 Pro 128GB from a set of 4 that I had bought a while back, $26.40 for all 4, so the one used here only cost me $6.60. I had received these laptops for free because they were deemed pretty useless, but I saw what these little guys could be capable of. I ended up spending $33.84 on the HP and $30.74 on the Sony. Depending how you look at the viability or necessity of upgrading an old device like this, even just as an experiment or something to play with or do, $30 for a little project is pretty doable. But did these upgrades even matter? The HP boots up in less than 30 seconds. I have a fair amount of old games on here. You can use your old collection, find good deals like Goodwill or archive.org, or some other sources. Either way, I have a fair amount of games that I test before and after. Unfortunately, the only performance upgrades are through the extra CPU oomph, as long as the RAM wasn't bottlenecking in the first place. In Fable, lowest settings at 640 by 480, there was virtually zero difference. I likely needed more GPU power to run this game. It was pretty unplayable. Halo Combat Evolved, on the other hand, while still at lowest settings, there was anywhere between 16% to 50% improvement, which was really nice. Even at sub 30 FPS average, I found myself playing through the first 4 levels of the game. I actually got farther in the game here than I was when I was 5-year-old playing on the original Xbox, so I consider this a win. There wasn't any difference in Thief Gold, but in Thief 2 there was roughly a 25% improvement from the upgraded CPU. Sonic Heroes didn't improve from its unplayable state, and Battlefield 1942 pretty much the same story. Very negligible within margin of error improvements. Morrowind had a tiny itsy-bitsy improvement, but it was still about 30 FPS. Playable. Half-Life on OpenGL didn't really improve, but it was already pretty smooth of an experience. Any diffs were from loading new areas, and Direct3D was way worse than OpenGL here. The Sims Complete Collection saw a 10% improvement in averages and 30% in minimums. Very playable for a sim. I'm on the Sony VAIO. This is with the i5 560M, something like that. 8 gigs of RAM and the 128 gig SSD. Let's venture up. Okay, there's there. At least it's better than a Kaveri APU at 3.7, at least in single-threaded. I'm gonna run Halo first. So we're at the max resolution of this monitor. I'm gonna go ahead and turn on max. All right, I mean, we're just under 60. Oh, okay, we dropped well under 60. So I'm gonna turn off specular and shadows. Yup. I think I want high frame rates rather than good graphics because those dips aren't my favorite. It jumps all the way down to 29. Low, medium. It already feels much smoother. I mean, the animations are just slow. Already way better compared to the old one. 68, 36, 29, 79, 47, 37. More consistent. About 30, just above 30 FPS here. That's fairly playable. And these are fairly default settings. I think we're good here. Boop, dead, and stop. And that's pretty consistent. Average of 51, 0.1% down to 21, but that was for that one stutter. But hey, Morrowind pretty smooth at moderate settings, high resolution. Let's try Fable. Turn off VSync, everything else can stay 30 FPS and above. Okay, with a lot of NPCs around, we're dropping but we're gonna be dropping everything else. Whoa, okay. There we go. I mean, lowest settings, it still looks completely fine, but way smoother. It can look like shite, but as long as she's smooth. All right, we're gonna start a little benchy here. She was a little all over the place. A little jumpy, but 57 average, but down to 24. You know what? It's totally fine. I'm just gonna speed run through this. Jenkins. The zero view distance actually hinders, but everything else off. And very low res. Hello, Valen.
Oh, look. An Imperial in the Imperial prison. I guess they don't play favorites, huh?
Usual mix-up with the watch. You will find your own path. Take care. There will be blood and death before the end.
Please, sire, we must keep moving.
Alright, we've just exited the sewers, and we're getting under 60 FPS, but it's still fairly smooth. The only issue is there's some pop-in. That's fine. Starting the bench, definitely not the most optimal to play this. Very stuttery in the frame times. Yeah. 55 down to 21. San Andreas. Draw distance is low, 800 by 600. Aw shit, here we go again. Above 30 FPS, that's not the worst. We're doing even better now by going to a higher resolution. Turn the draw distance all the way up. Doesn't hurt that much. This isn't that bad of an experience. Okay, draw distance goes down a little bit. We're at 720p. That's not too shabby. Who would have guessed? First gen core integrated GPU on a laptop. That's a win. Before you can ask the question on everyone's lips, can run crises. I don't have hopes. I can't wait to have a crisis.
EAE. EAEA.
Graphic. Okay, we're gonna give it the best shot I can. 800 by 600. Don't care. Skip. Don't care. Do I have to watch this? Like, actually? I can't even alt-tab. This game sucks. At least alt F4 works. 25 FPS. We get a cinematic experience. Do they expect me to kill this turtle? I guess technically you can play Crisis. I'm doing this just so you guys won't comment it. Just so you'll shut the hell up. Okay, I take it back. Absolutely not playable. Come on, you should be headshots. I play Counter-Strike. Oh my god. Okay, we're done. 22 FPS with lows down to 1. But hey, it runs Crisis. Now excuse me while I go have one. Let's put the i3 back in here just to see what happens. i3 M350. We still have 8 gigs of RAM in the SSD, so time to bench. I don't remember. I guess I can compare them later. Seem to be doing just fine here. It's still just as smooth, perfect as before. 67, 40, 35, 68, 36, 29. Probably just within margin of error. They seem to be completely the same. Morrowind. And I think I was above 30 here. Boom, dead. All right. 41, 32, 11. 51, 39, 21. That is much faster, about 25% faster. Still playable. It is, I think, a little lower though. Here's the new one, 55, 30, 24. 57, 27, 24. All right, Oblivion. Oh, wow, that's harsh. All right, 3 Oblivion, 44, 25, 4, and that was a really harsh frame time. Oh shit, here we go again. 49, 24, 21, 48, 21, 17. Pretty the same. Time to have a crisis, I guess. I don't know why we're even doing this. It didn't run before. Why do we think it's gonna run now? God, okay, this sucks. I hate this. This is bad. Come on. Is this worse? This feels worse. 18, 2, 1, 22, 3, 1. That was the benchies. Back to future me. Why would you even want to revive an old device like this? The lack of internet connection is quite the handicap for a computer. Upgrading costs a bit of extra money, and older hardware is much less efficient than newer hardware. And that raises your electricity bill, and plus you can play many of these old games on your main system anyway, so what's the point? Reviving an old device, keeping these electronics out of a landfill, minimizing e-waste is always a plus in my book. And an old device like this may be useful when running old software that doesn't work on newer operating systems. You don't necessarily even have to spend more on these obsolete devices. maybe at least an SSD. And at least for the HP, 2 GB of RAM is overkill for this tier of hardware and operating system. And given the slight increase in gaming performance, you wouldn't even need to find a better processor. I just did because I wanted to max these guys out and see what they could do. But will I use these in the future? Maybe. I've had these for nearly a year now, and running old titles on hardware that can barely run them is endearing in its own way. So please, if you have an old laptop with a dead battery and a dying hard drive, clean it up, throw a $10 SSD in there, and go play some retro games. Breathe some life into an older device instead of throwing it away. It's a piece of history, and even with its limitations, as a computer enthusiast, we should be appreciating all hardware for what it is.